My name is Betsy Gardella. I'm the president of New Hampshire Public Radio, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. It is snowing a little bit, but just a little bit, so sit back and relax and enjoy. It is, gosh, you know, there's been some disturbing media news, some sad media news lately. You know, the passing of David Carr, the fabulous David Carr, and the Brian Williams brouhaha. And so it is just particularly special, I think, tonight to be honoring one of the great men of journalism with the inaugural David Broder Award. It's I think, a very special and wonderful beginning of a tradition here at the Rudman Center. At New Hampshire Public Radio, we're really blessed to partner with John Broderick and the Rudman Center. We did a whole series of candidate conversations this year. We have a series that's called Justice and Journalism. There are events like this that we get to partner on. And just so you know, tomorrow morning, E.J. and Dan are going to be Laura Canoy's guests on the exchange. So I hope you'll tune in and tell your friends and neighbors to do the same. Since John has been heading up the Rudman Center, it has become the place for this incredible exchange of ideas about the things that really matter to us in New Hampshire and I think around the country. So with that, please join me in welcoming John Broderick.
Thank you very much for coming on this July night in New Hampshire. Let me return serve for a moment to Betsy Gardella. She's been on this landscape a lot longer than the Rudman Center. It's just a pleasure to know her, but a joy to collaborate with her. I love NHPR. Tonight's event didn't happen necessarily easily. And when I see people of this quality and all of you here, I think, well, that wasn't that hard. Trust me, it was that hard. But I do want to thank, in addition to NHPR and Nixon Peabody, the law firm of Nixon Peabody, by the way, which is hosting tonight's event. Gordon McDonald's here. I appreciate that immensely. I want to thank somebody here all of you know, and that's Lou Feldstein. And if you know Lou Feldstein, you know at least a third of the planet. And he has email addresses for most of them. And so I asked him some weeks ago, months ago, if he could help me reach out to E.J. Dionne, who I said will not be taking my calls. And Lou did. I ended up, from that call, speaking to Matt Broder, David Broder's son, and through all of that, speaking to Dan Balz. Two of the great journalists in the United States are sitting here on Washington Street in Concord, New Hampshire on a snowy night. It's pretty extraordinary, pretty extraordinary. Now, before I step aside for a moment, I just want to say that I have been a great fan of David Broder's, whom I met once for 32 seconds in an elevator in Hanover. Seemed like a week to me, probably seemed like a month to him. But I met him. And to tell you that I've been a fan of his for a long time, in 1987, I was 14 years old, or thereabouts. In 1987, Steve McAuliffe, who many of you know, now Judge McAuliffe, and I wrote an op-ed piece. That was a leap of faith. Having no idea whether it would ever be published. We were noted authors at the time to our families. And so we wrote this, what we thought was fabulous, op-ed piece. And so we sent it to the Boston Sunday Globe, wondering if they'd ever return our call. And they said, we're going to publish your op-ed piece in the Sunday Globe. That would be one of the 3 highlights of my life. That tells you about my life. But so when we got to Sunday Globe, and there it was, I bought 14 papers that day, and there it was, The Dangers of Media Preconceptions, yours truly, and Stephen McAuliffe. Now, normally you would cut that out, you'd put it in a scrapbook and put it away, and someday try to impress your children. I did impress my mother, that was easy, or my grandchildren. But I didn't do that. In fact, I had it plasticized with a hanger on the back because above me, on my op-ed page, was this author by the name of David S. Broder, who had also written a piece. And so for years I said that David Broder wrote a piece on my op-ed page. I don't think he would find it to be true, but I kept it. And I've had it for 30 years because David Broder's name was on it. And so I didn't just become a fan of David Broder last week. And I just can't tell you, life is funny. Really, life is funny. For me to be standing here tonight with Matt Broder here and these 2 gentlemen here to honor his legacy. Wish my mother were here. She wouldn't believe it. She'd say, you made something of yourself, finally. It's pretty extraordinary. So I want to thank Matt for being here, and E.J. Dionne, who I think of as one of the thought leaders in the American press. And I think Dan Balz is the gold standard of political journalism in the United States. And the last thing I want to say before I sit down, I promise, is something my mother used to tell me, by the way, and I thought she was just being nice, but it turns out to be true. And these 3 gentlemen here tonight have proven my mother right. She used to say to me, if you go to the top of any profession, you meet really quality people. And if you're not meeting them, it means you haven't gone high enough. I don't know these people, but I feel like I do. My wife was impressed that Dan Balz was responding to my emails. I said, I've arrived. And E.J. Dionne takes my calls. Pretty extraordinary. Tonight should be very special. I know it will be. And I wanted to have a student come up, and I will momentarily, to introduce Matt Broder, to talk for a few minutes. And then I'm going to have a student come up and introduce E.J. Dionne, who will speak about David Broder and about tonight's guest, and he will introduce him. And then at the end, I'll be back up to present the award. But before we do that, I wanted to show 2 clips here. One of them, ironically, has Brian Williams in it. Who would have thought that would have been unusual? But it's not that he's in it, it's that he's talking about David Broder when he passed. And the other film is David Broder in New Hampshire. He loved this state. And I don't have to tell you that, he'll tell you. So I'd like you to watch those 2 clips. They maybe last 2.5 minutes. And then I'll have a student come up here at the law school who's involved in the Rudman Center Student Advisory Board to introduce Matt Broder. So with that, hopefully, we'll see some footage on the film.
I've got a lot of memories of talking to voters here and across the country. One of my favorite experiences in reverse was being run off of a property by a guy who came out with 2 very large dogs and made it very clear that if I didn't clear out of there pretty fast, he was going to let those dogs off their leash. What's fun about covering New Hampshire campaigns is that the people here not just the politicians, but the people themselves are really into it.
I've been working on this campaign and Obama's. The prior campaign I worked for was when I was a senior in high school, and I worked for JFK.
Wow! You see more front yard and back fence campaign signs in this state than any other place that I've ever been, because the people really do feel very committed to the candidates that they're supporting. And that level of energy that comes straight from the people is what makes New Hampshire politics just really wonderful.
Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist David Broder has died. He was a Washington fixture, for most of his life a reporter for the Washington Post, and regarded by so many as the very best in the business. A proud product of Illinois, he entered the University of Chicago at age 15. He had the bearing of a professor. He was equal parts Luddite and pack rat. He thrived on deadlines and he thrived on facts. He was a great mentioner of future presidential candidates, a great traveler who refused to be trapped in Washington. And when he felt his own writing veering into the conventional wisdom, he would take himself to task in print. Broder was a Sunday morning fixture as well. He held the record among reporters on Meet the Press, appearing over 400 times. He loved politics, but he hated what had become of our politics in recent years. David Broder was 81 years old.
All right, thank you and welcome everybody. And welcome Matthew Broder. Thank you for being here in honor of your father. Matt is currently the Vice President of Corporate Communications at Damon Worldwide since 2013 out of Connecticut. Damon Worldwide is a leader in creating successful private brands for food and other retailers in more than 50 countries. Matt and his team are responsible for all aspects of internal, external, social media, and marketing communications. Matt's prior experience includes working in corporate communications for over 2 decades at industry giants United Technologies and Pitney Bowes, where he was responsible for speech writing, employee communications, annual reports, advertising, trade shows, public relations, and corporate citizenship. Matt graduated from Yale University and the Yale School of Management, where he has returned to teach business communication workshops, as well as the Yale School of Drama and the Fairfield County Community Foundation. Matt and his wife Susan currently reside in Hamden, Connecticut, and are the parents of 3 grown children, Daniel, Madeline, and Emma. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Very nice to be here. Thank you, Dean Broderick, although perhaps I could call you Dean Broderick for the evening. Maybe we're related, distant. It really is very nice to be here, and thank you all for coming out to honor my father with this award. On behalf of David's wife, Ann, my mother, and my brothers, George, Josh, and Mike, I'm very pleased to be able to share with you our family's thanks for creating this award and for selecting the incomparable Dan Balz as its first recipient. In all honesty, I'm not quite sure what my dad would have made of all this attention to his name and legacy. He had a Midwesterner's natural modesty from Chicago Heights, Illinois, and he was encouraged by regular reminders from his mother, my grandmother, that although he was her only child and therefore perfect, not to get too big a head about that. It says a lot about both of them that when my father asked permission to take a summer road trip to the Grand Canyon with some college friends in the 1940s, my grandmother okayed the trip with one stipulation. He must write a postcard and send it to her every day. And he did. In terms of his importance to the national political conversation, my dad had a pretty square head about that. Here's a true story that he loved to tell. In 1983, at the height of his influence as a columnist, with more than 300 papers running his words every week, he had a problem. Rupert Murdoch had purchased the Chicago Sun-Times, and my father wanted to have nothing to do with an op-ed page that was run by Rupert Murdoch. What to do? He consulted with his distributor, the Washington Post Writers Group, and soon thereafter the request went out. Would it be okay if the David Broder column switched from the Sun-Times to the rival paper in Chicago, the Tribune? The powers that be at the Sun-Times considered the request, and in due course the answer came back. Yes, Mr. Broder, we will let you switch to the Tribune, but there's something we want from the Tribune in return. Further negotiations followed, and ultimately an accord was reached that satisfied everyone. And that is how David Broder's column started to appear in the Tribune, and the comic strip Hagar the Horrible started appearing in the Sun-Times. True story. As you could tell from the video clip we just saw, New Hampshire really did sincerely hold a special place in my father's heart. He may have been the Post's national political correspondent for decades, but that doesn't mean he loved all 50 states equally. New Hampshire was always right on Dave's wavelength. He certainly spent enough time here. The running joke in the family was that he could get from any point A in New Hampshire to any point B in New Hampshire with his eyes closed, but he couldn't find his way from one side of Arlington, Virginia, to the other without our help. I think what he found really unique and inspiring about this state was how seriously the voters take their responsibility to vet the candidates for president every 4 years. Dave was never terribly interested in horse race reporting about politics, but his eyes would light up at the intersection of politics and policy, or to put a finer point on it, politics and problem solving. For someone with that sensibility, New Hampshire offers a very fertile and welcoming landscape. In his thousands of interviews with voters here over the years, and his observation of countless more conversations between candidates and voters, Dave saw evidence of democracy at work that fed his unshakable optimism about our country. So for feeding that optimism throughout my father's career, I offer you our family's sincere thanks. It's an honor to be here and a great pleasure to be able to enjoy your company. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lindsay Robinson. It's my honor to welcome and introduce Mr. E.J. Dionne as a speaker for tonight's Rudman Center event. Mr. Dionne hails from Boston, Massachusetts, where he graduated from Harvard University with a Bachelor of Arts in Social Studies, and also where he served as a Rhodes Scholar. As an American journalist and a political commentator, Mr. Dionne is the author of a long-time popular op-ed column for the Washington Post. Mr. Dionne has published many books about American politics, a number of which have made the best-selling list. In addition, he has served as a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute, a university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at the McCourt School of Public Policy, and an NPR, MSNBC, and PBS commentator. We are lucky to have Mr. Dionne here tonight as he helped recognizes the important work of his colleague Dan Balz.
That was so sweet. That is, first of all, I feel guilty because I don't have my ashes, so I hope you'll give me absolution. And it's so much nicer than the introduction I've often gotten, you know, and now for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. So thank you so much for that. It's a real honor to be here at the Rudman Center. I love the fact that it's not just the Rudman Center for Leadership and Policy. The word justice comes first. And that is a wonderful thing. And I don't know this John Broderick business about, you know, I wouldn't return his call. Lou Feldstein called me and I said, John Broderick wants to talk to me, so God bless you. John, the Chief Justice of the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And I do want to thank John and Lou Feldstein. By the way, Lou Feldstein is the character in that famous story of the person who went to see Pope Francis, and somebody sort of comes to the event and says, you know, who's that guy there with Lou Feldstein? You know, I mean, he really does know everyone, and also Ned Helms and Tom Rath, who are not only fixtures of New Hampshire politics, but really, really, really helpful to people like Dan and me. I love this state, too. I've been coming here since I was a kid. I had an aunt, you can tell I'm from New England, she's an aunt, not an aunt who lived up in Danbury, and I used to take rides in an old truck around the Ragged Mountains, and I almost killed myself during the 1972 New Hampshire primary. My car did a 180 on 93, and I was very grateful that it was a wide road. There was a lot of snow. I liked the snow out there today, and there was no damage to me, my passenger, or the car. And the New Hampshire cop was so upset that he couldn't give me a ticket that he finally gave me a ticket for bald tires. And it was the happiest ticket I've ever paid, thus saving you, in doing my small bit to save New Hampshire from any broad-based taxes. I also, what a terrible thing to have to come after Matt. No one is going to top your Hagar the Horrible story. That was such a wonderful tribute to your father. There are so many of us who love New Hampshire. I just want to say one other thing about, we were telling New Hampshire primary stories, and on a night like this, it did remind me of Mo Udall, who was shaking hands outside a plant gate back in 1976. And for those of you who remember, Fred Harris ran in that primary, and Fred Harris's slogan was, "The issue is privilege." And so as Mo Udall is shaking the hands, a young campaigner for Fred Harris is giving out leaflets, "The issue is privilege, the issue is privilege." And finally, Mo Udall looked at the young campaigner and said, "The issue is pneumonia." And so it is so nice of all of you to come out tonight. Everything David said about New Hampshire is true. And Dan and I were talking about this tonight. Some people, for their kind of religious experiences, go to Jerusalem or Mecca or Salt Lake City or St. Peter's. The place in our hearts that resembles that is Epping. And really, this is true. Epping is a very special place to Dan and me, and we went during the 92 primary, and Tom Harkin was appearing, and it was a perfect New Hampshire house. It was, it was probably erected by somebody from some network. It was a perfect New Hampshire house, a perfect New Hampshire living room, about 30 people, maybe 25 people, asking far more sophisticated questions of Tom Harkin than anybody ever asked him on Meet the Press or This Week or anywhere else. And Dan and I said, this is what American democracy is about. I just want to say a couple of things about Dave Broder, and then some things I'm going to try to ruin my friend Dan's reputation, but in a very particular way. I love David Broder from the moment I met him, and appropriately enough, I met him here in New Hampshire. And I was 23 years old in 1976, and it was in the weeks before the New Hampshire primary. I was then working for the New York Times, and I found myself in a press room. I think it was during a debate. And there was Dave Broder, one of the most famous and accomplished reporters in the United States, and he came bounding in after doing some reporting. He was always doing reporting. And he had these notes, and he went up to a young colleague, and he said, "Here, you can use these." And it was a really stunning moment. Some of you know the journalistic term Bigfoot, where the big guy comes along and knocks out the younger man or woman. Dave Broder could have Bigfooted anybody he wanted in America, and here was David Broder being the leg man for his younger colleague. And that's the kind of generosity Dave Broder showed again and again and again. He was a reporter's reporter, but he was, and Dan is going to talk about this, I know, he was also a citizen's reporter and a voter's reporter above all. It wasn't that he knew every governor and every state party chair in the country or some very large percentage of county commissioners, state legislators, city council members. It's that he felt compelled constantly to go door to door to talk to voters. And they weren't objects for Broder, they were subjects. He wasn't trolling for good quotes. He really wanted to know how people thought and felt. He wanted to understand how they saw our country and what it needed. One of the best journalistic projects I ever worked on was a Broder brainstorm, 1991. He had a sense that something was happening in the country, even though President George H.W. Bush was around 80% in the polls. And so he organized this project where we all set out to, around the country, I remember it was San Bernardino, California, Fort Worth, Texas, Kenosha, Wisconsin, that's where I went, Dover, Delaware, Charlotte, North Carolina. And we were, for a week, we went to community meetings, we went door to door, we met local officials, and we all came back and sensed something is happening in the country, that there was disaffection that you weren't catching in Washington. And a lot of what people were saying were the sorts of things that might make you think that someone as surprising as Ross Perot could become a candidate. Now, you could say that this series, which came out from that reporting, was prophetic. David Broder would just say that it was good reporting. The other thing which I think has emerged already is the great Broder paradox. You know, David was a pillar of the Washington establishment, yet he was the least establishmentarian person you could ever meet. He never stopped being a person of the Midwest. He was impatient with the mores of stuffy Washington. And this came out especially in the annual columns he wrote about his beloved Beaver Island vacation spot in Michigan, kind of his newfound lake, if you will. He wrote in 1982, "I take a lot of abuse from colleagues back in Washington who spend their summer vacations at fashionable places on Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, or the coast of Maine." Matt, I bet he really enjoyed writing that sentence. I could just see him. They insist that because they have cocktails with an undersecretary and cookouts with an ambassador, they are more with it than we are on this never-heard-of island at the top of Lake Michigan. They are wrong, of course. I have known for more than 30 years that Beaver Island is the center of the real world. And so David was a small d Democrat to the depths of his soul. He was a giver, a listener, a sharer, and a friend. And that's why the only person in America who was the logical first winner of the Dave Broder Award was my friend Dan Balz, and my friend and colleague Dan Balz. And I'm going to ruin his reputation because, as you all know, journalists like having reputations for being, hard-nosed, hard-drinking, hard-hearted, tough-minded, all those hard things, those Damon Runyon things. You'd almost think that journalists kind of want to be boxers or something. But Dan Balz is all those things in one sense. He is hard-nosed. You can never get anything by him. He knows too much about politics for anybody to put anything over on him. He's an extraordinary reporter who always gets it right. And just this morning, I had a Dan Balz experience about Dan always getting it right. I was going back for something I was writing to an ad that had run during the Obama campaign, and there were conflicting accounts. Dan had said the ad was run by the Obama campaign. Another account said it was run by one of the super PACs. I asked my intern, check this out. Sure enough, Dan was right. It was run by the Obama campaign, and I wrote my intern back thanking him for looking it up, and I said, this just proves, once again, always believe Dan Balz. And that's the kind of reporter he is. But the reason I'm going to ruin his reputation is that when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, I thought first of an experience I had which said an awful lot about what I feel about Dan and, unfortunately, also what I feel about my own profession. I was talking to someone about Dan, and I said, Dan is really unusual for journalists. And before I realized what I was saying, I said, he's a really moral person. So there you go, my real view of journalism. But it's also true of Dan. And what will really ruin his reputation is when I was thinking of what to say tonight, what came to mind is the prayer of St. Francis. And now the problem with being a journalist is you look stuff up, and there is great dispute that actually St. Francis wrote this prayer, but I say damn the fact checkers. I think it's the prayer of St. Francis, you know, where there is, let me be an instrument of thy peace, where there is hatred, let me sow love, injury, pardon, doubt, faith, despair, hope, darkness, light, sadness, joy, and also this, which is a great slogan for journalists, by the way, O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be understood as to understand. And Dan is all these things, and when you looked at reporting at the Washington Post has been a real joy over the years, back before I was an opinionated columnist, and we had a reputation for being happy warriors. Everyone on that team was happy in what they were doing. And that's partly because, in large part, because the leaders of that team, Dave Broder and Dan Balz, took real joy in their work. I have never understood why people who actually have a choice in the matter, and we should always remember, there are a lot of people who aren't lucky enough to be able to choose their work. But if you are lucky enough to be able to choose what you do, why don't you take joy in it? I have never liked politicians who complain about being politicians. Either I don't believe them, or I want to ask, well, why are you a politician? Then, well, Dan always took joy. And he and David created a sense of community among all of us, where we were just really happy to be part of this group, really happy to be doing this job, and realizing what every journalist must always realize, which is this sure beats working for a living. And so I just want to say, for those of you who should know it, Dan is the chief correspondent of the Washington Post. He was the Post national editor, political editor, White House correspondent, Southwest correspondent. It's not on his bio, but he also served in London and loves covering British politics almost as much as he loves covering things up here in New Hampshire. He's written several books, and I can tell you they are great books and don't have mistakes in them, because I have recently fact-checked one. The Battle for America 2008, The Story of an Extraordinary Election, and Collision 2012, Obama versus Romney and the Future of Elections in America. He has received many, many journalistic awards for excellence in journalism, including the Merriman Smith Award for excellence in presidential coverage by the White House Correspondents Association. He is a regular guest on Washington Week, The Daily Rundown, and a lot of other television programs. But the most important thing is that he is simply one of the best human beings I have ever met, and it's just such an honor to be here and to welcome Dan as the appropriate first winner of the David Broder Award.
Thank you. I just said to E.J., you truly have ruined my reputation. E.J. and I spent a month here in 1992 camped out at the Wayfarer. We commandeered one whole wing in the back corner of the Wayfarer so that we could look out over the falls as we would write our stories. We had chips and salsa sent up from Austin, Texas. Dave was down the way in another room. And we've always remembered that as perhaps the most glorious time we ever had. It was the middle of that intense primary that Bill Clinton came in second and declared himself the comeback kid. But I went over to the Wayfarer today to take a look, and they're obviously demolishing it. And the demolishers were at work, and they threw me out of there. They said, well, why are you here? Who are you with? I said, well, I used to stay here a lot. And they said, well, you can't be around here. But I went around and shot some photos, which I'm going to give to E.J. When we're done. And he also mentioned that Epping, the night in Epping, we walked out. We had dinner before we came over here, and we walked out and saw the snow, and we both had the same reaction. It's Epping. It's an Epping night, because that night was gentle snow, not what you've had most of the winter. Here's my first bit of advice for anybody here, and you probably have already figured this out. If you ever are addressing a group and need somebody to introduce you, ask E.J. to do the introduction. He's obviously funny and enlightening and unfailingly generous, and if you are a normal human being, you will blush with over his superlatives, but nonetheless, they're great to have. I want to thank John Broderick and everyone else here at the Rudman Center, Tom Rath and Ned Helms, who are old pals from many campaigns ago, Deli for the work that she did, but for creating this. This lecture series that pays tribute to Dave in the state whose politics and political culture he so admired. I think it's obviously a very fitting way to remember the best political reporter of his generation or any generation. I say this from the bottom of my heart. I am deeply honored to be the first person to kick off what I know will be an esteemed series of lectures over many years. Thank you especially to Matt Broder for being here. The Broder family has become part of my and my wife Nancy's extended family over the many years that Dave and I worked together, and in the years since his passing. And we thank the Broder family for many things, particularly for sharing David with us for so many years, and now for helping to establish this lecture series. You obviously take your first in the nation status pretty seriously here. In a time of partisan warfare, I think the hashtag FITN is the great uniter in this state. Would I be wrong to call you all obsessive about your primary? I'm not sure there was ever a more ardent defender of the New Hampshire primary than David Broder. Maybe Bill Gardner. But I would venture to say that Dave Broder got to the front of the line first, and Bill Gardner is carrying on that tradition. Dave accepted that Iowa's caucuses started the presidential nominating circus, but he was always content to let others worry about that state. He believed that New Hampshire was the most important of the early tests. As the rest of us would leave for the frozen cornfields of Iowa, he would say with a smile, "I will be waiting for you in New Hampshire." And he was. And as the video showed, he had a special appreciation for the people of this state, for the seriousness with which you all approach the responsibility of examining and vetting candidates for president. However, I will just add, be thankful that the primary is next winter and not this winter. Given the snow and the cold of this year, you might lose a few friends of FITN if the primary were being held this month. When I drove up from Manchester this afternoon, it was as if a new southern range of the White Mountains had suddenly sprung up here. So I traveled many roads with Dave Broder over many years, occasionally harrowing roads if he was driving and it was at night, but nonetheless, we shared many, many meals and almost as many bylines. Often he would take the lead in writing a story, and then he would insist that my name go first. He was that kind of colleague. I have a lot of New Hampshire memories about David. One that I will never forget was in 1980. He and Lou Cannon, who are our two ace reporters that year, were here for the first Republican debate after the Iowa caucuses. And they had decided to cover the debate from the quiet comfort of the Wayfarer Hotel. Now, there are many good reasons to not go to the debate center and to do it from the hotel room. It's much quieter. You can actually hear the candidates. You don't have the din of the filing center. There's room service readily available. There are good reasons if the local TV station is actually carrying the debate live, which, as it turned out, wasn't that night. It was delayed by at least 30 minutes. And I was in the newsroom in Washington preparing to edit the story. And Dave called a few minutes before the debate was to start. And he said, "We have a little problem." And he said it in a way that you instantly knew we had a big problem. And he said, "Lou and I need somebody in Washington to watch the beginning of the debate while we figure out what to do." Now, they eventually found a live radio feed. They didn't get to that for maybe 15 or 20 or 25 minutes into the debate, so someone back in Washington was monitoring and taking notes. It is a fact that not one person at the Washington Post saw the entirety of that debate that night. You would never know that from the story that was written, but that is the truth. I remember also the last night that we were all up here together with Dave, and this was the night before the 2008 primary. There were a group of Post reporters who had gathered for dinner before we went out to watch the final rallies. We were there to honor David for basically half a century of reporting on New Hampshire primaries. And you know, as Matt suggested, David did not like to be fussed over. He did not like to be feted. But nonetheless, you know, he was in good spirits. He was dressed in his typical New Hampshire road gear, which was to say a battered old corduroy jacket and a plaid shirt, not exactly TV ready. But he was totally in his element. He loved these moments when the voters were about to speak. And at one point, we were having a conversation and somebody said, "Do you have any last-minute observations?" David looked around, this group of us. "Watch Ron Paul," he said. Everybody looked around. What does that mean? So younger reporters then started to tell their own David Broder stories. One said that during a Halloween party when he was in college, he had dressed up in costume as David Broder. David looked at him. "Did you win the contest?" he asked. Another reporter, who once had had a fear of flying, said she remembered being incredibly relieved when she got to the airport one day to take a flight to Iowa and realized that Dave was going to be on the same flight. She said she remembered thinking to herself, "This plane cannot crash. David Broder is on this plane." Another told him that she had been reading his columns since 1976. And she said, "I know that because that's the year I learned to read." David got this look on his face and he said, "We're hiring children now." Finally, someone recalled that at a staff meeting a few weeks earlier, that David had made a private prediction that Barack Obama would become the next president of the United States. Now, obviously, Obama stumbled the next day in New Hampshire, but David's observation, long before it was conventional wisdom, turned out to be correct. Somebody said, "Well, David, how do you know that? How did you know that?" And David said, again with a chuckle, "Well, he's from Illinois," Illinois being David's home state. It was a typical way that he dealt with those kinds of questions, questions he didn't really want to answer. He answered with modesty and with a quip that would give away nothing about the secrets to his success. As has already been said, Dave Broder was a reporter's reporter. He brought integrity and humility to his craft. He listened to people, no matter how grand or small their station in life. He took their scattered observations, he spun them into the wisdom that he dispensed in his writing. And he taught all of us how to cover politics. And what I would like to do tonight in my time is reflect a little on what we all learned from David over many years and try to apply those lessons to today's politics and today's political journalism. We are, as everybody knows, in an era of deep partisan polarization. Our politics has become almost tribal in nature, red versus blue. Across this yawning gulf, each side views the other in almost apocalyptic terms. This has gotten progressively worse over the last decade. Public cynicism towards politicians is high. Money is seen as corrupting the process. In Washington, we've seen an extended period of dysfunction and political gridlock. Our media culture is dramatically different too. Decades past the time when a few major news organizations dominated news coverage and acted almost as gatekeepers. The pace of change keeps accelerating. From the 24/7 cable culture of just a few years ago, we have progressed to the instantaneousness of Twitter, where conventional wisdom is declared and revised with every new blip of information that comes along, where almost anything can become white hot for a moment until something else comes along to distract our attentions. The press today is far more fractured and ideological. Our audience is fractured as well, able to get news from sources that reinforce rather than challenge biases. We tell stories in old and new ways. Long narratives, deep investigations, listicles, maps, graphics, all designed to engage readers where they get their news, which increasingly is on smartphones or tablets. This is also a troubled time in our business. Last week's suspension of Brian Williams, who we just watched on the screen as the anchor of NBC's nightly newscast, is obviously a personal story about one broadcaster. But I think it is also an institutional story as well. Public trust in the media was low before this happened, and something like this makes it all the more difficult to regain that trust. Dave gave a speech back in 1979 at the National Press Club. He decried in that speech what he called click journalism. Let me quote a portion of what he said. In recent years, our reporting of government and national politics has narrowed the coverage of the insiders, by the insiders, for the insiders. He went on, I dwell on the dangers of such coverage because I think it corrupts our character. It diverts us from the main function of serving the broad public, and it alienates us from that public whose support is ultimately the only safeguard of the professional freedom we require to do our jobs. That was 35 years ago. If anything, I think the problem is more acute today. I sometimes fear that political coverage has become ever more a conversation within a relatively closed community. I mentioned Twitter. It's a powerful and valuable medium, a news ticker for all of us, and a virtual water cooler to share insights. But no one should assume that the community on Twitter is a reflection of the public at large. A recent Pew study found that just 19% of adult Americans regularly use Twitter. We should not be fooled into thinking that what interests those of us who pay attention to Twitter are the things that really matter to voters. Dave always liked to say elections belong to the voters. They don't belong to candidates and they don't belong to the press. Dave put it this way when Tim Krause interviewed him for his book, The Boys on the Bus. A presidential election is, he said, the only real chance every 4 years when they, the voters, ought to be able to get their questions answered and get the kind of commitments that they're interested in from these candidates. We pay more than ample attention as reporters to the views of political strategists. We pay now more than ample attention to the views of fundraisers. I think one of the biggest changes I've seen over the past decade or so is the degree to which we all seek out and give credence to rich people who fund campaigns. Now, they are obviously important to the candidates, but are their views about the state of play or the real problems affecting most families any more important than those of average voters? Our tastes as journalists change quickly, and so do our judgments. If you look back over the last 18 months or so, we have at one time or another anointed first Marco Rubio, then Chris Christie, and now Jeb Bush as the apparent GOP frontrunner. We have described the Republican nomination at different times as one that appeared to be a contest between Chris Christie and Rand Paul, or Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney when it looked like Mitt Romney might join the race, or more recently, Jeb Bush and Scott Walker. We must guard against the rush to get too far ahead of the voters. There is a natural rhythm to campaigns, and if Dave taught us anything, it is that things always change when we begin to hear directly from the voters. Here's what David said 4 decades ago about candidates in this early period in campaigns. Quote, they're campaigning for us and putting on parades for us in the press. They're putting on shows for other politicians. It has very little to do with the voters. A good case could be made that we shouldn't say anything about them at all, except that's an impossible rule to follow in this town, Washington, or this state, New Hampshire, because the appetite for politics is continuous. But no matter how you play it, you're going to end up with a rather low yield of significant information in an odd-numbered year. Nobody is infallible as a political reporter. David was the best of his generation, but he could be completely wrong at times. He was at least willing to own up to it. He underestimated George McGovern in 1972, and like the rest of us, he thought Barack Obama would win the New Hampshire primary in 2008. He often said that one of his cardinal rules of politics is that the lessons of the last campaign rarely provide a roadmap for the next campaign, and that the reporter who was spot on in one cycle could be as dumb as you know what in the next cycle. I think that is why Dave approached his job with such humility. He once said, quote, we journalists always deal with partial information and know less than we should. We never have as much time as we need. We must display our ignorance and haste in the most obvious way, by writing or broadcasting stories read or watched by people who know a hell of a lot more about the subject than we do. As reporters, Dave taught us that we should not try to tell people what to think. We should suggest through our reporting and analysis how they might think for themselves about the campaign and the candidates. We also should not presume to tell voters what is in their self-interest. We should take more seriously that voters themselves know best what is self-interest. The pollster Peter Hart once offered me some advice I've never forgotten. We were talking about political journalism, and I think Peter knows as much about our business as he does about politics. And he said, "You are not horse pickers." He said, "Your job is not to pick or predict winners. Rather, it is to help people understand why things have happened. If we have done our jobs, when people hear the results after a close and competitive election, they will understand the forces and the conditions that produce those results." I remember back in 1980, there were some people who were rather astonished that Ronald Reagan was elected president. But to the extent they were, it was a failure on all our parts to explain how America had changed, how the shift in population from the Northeast to the Midwest, from the Midwest and Northeast to the Sun Belt had helped change our politics, and how the conservative movement had taken root, arisen, and expanded. As an institution, political coverage is driven by polls more than it should be, and perhaps more than it ever has been. That's a cliche now, but true. We are flooded with polling data, some of it good, some of it not so good. In the overheated environment in which we operate, we often fail to distinguish one from another. We sometimes seize on outlier polls. We reshape coverage on the basis of a poll for better or worse. Sometimes we're saved by good polling. I remember one night here in New Hampshire in February 1984. The Post and ABC had decided to do a tracking poll in the week or so before the primary. Excuse me. The tracking a week out showed Walter Mondale with a double-digit lead. On the Sunday night before the primary, the tracking suddenly showed Gary Hart surging. On Monday night, he was in a tie with Mondale. Everyone, we included, had more or less already awarded the primary to Walter Mondale. But we were able to recast our coverage to let our readers know what was about to happen. I only wish we had had similarly good information the night before the 2008 primary, when we all assumed Obama would defeat Hillary Clinton. We saw polls that showed Obama ahead, well ahead, and we believed the race was over. So too did the Obama campaign. In New Hampshire, that's always a fatal mistake. On the morning after that primary, chagrined, I looked back at my own coverage of the previous 5 days, and I realized that I had missed any number of clues as to what was really happening. For example, I had paid too much attention to the size of Obama's crowds, but not enough attention to the fact that Hillary Clinton was drawing audiences almost as large. I didn't pay enough attention to what people at the Obama rallies were actually telling me. There was evidence for anyone willing to listen, and listen carefully, that even in the middle of a boisterous Obama rally, some of the people there were still shopping for a candidate. More voters, obviously, than anyone realized at the time. I overlooked the Clintons' ties to New Hampshire. I underestimated the strength of Clinton's appeal to women, who made up 57% of the primary electorate. I did not analyze correctly that Obama was running an extended victory party after Iowa, and that Hillary Clinton was doggedly appealing to the many undecided voters left in the state. It was something of the same story back in 2003 and early 2004, as we all marveled at Howard Dean's grassroots army of volunteers wearing orange stocking caps who were flooding into Iowa to turn out the vote. The only problem? It was a mirage. We thought until the last days of that race that the race there was between Howard Dean and Dick Gebhardt. Turned out the race was between John Kerry and John Edwards. I remember going into the windowless room in Kerry's headquarters in downtown Des Moines the morning of the caucuses and seeing the evidence on the walls all around this tiny little room of the support that had been growing for Kerry week by week. Now, for strategic reasons, the Kerry campaign had kept that information quiet. As it turned out, Howard Dean ended up turning out voters who by then were supporting John Kerry. Almost nobody saw any of that coming until the Des Moines Register poll a couple of days before the caucuses showed Dean sinking. I say almost nobody because two reporters did see the hollowness of the Dean organization well before that. Jeff Zeleny, who's now at ABC News, was at the Chicago Tribune at the time. In December, he and his colleague Flynn McRoberts, what a great byline, Flynn McRoberts, had gone from far from Des Moines and written that the Dean Army appeared to be a paper tiger. Most of us overlooked or dismissed that report. All of that is a reminder of what David used to say and do, which is pay attention to the voters. Dave institutionalized door knocking. He would slog up and down the streets of neighborhoods in strange towns for hours on end. Sometimes I would go with him and I would get worn out long before he did. He went into living rooms, he engaged people in conversation. As has been said before, he listened to what people had to say. He learned their hopes and their fears. Most of all, he respected their opinions. In '72, from that reporting in this state, he learned that Ed Muskie, who was then the presumptive frontrunner for the nomination, was in far worse shape in this state than anyone knew at the time, which was borne out when the results came in. Catherine Kramer Walsh is a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she wrote an insightful paper a few years ago based on 4 years of listening to people in local communities around her state as they talked about politics and political affairs. She offered this advice in her conclusion, quote, "We need to do more listening in the study of public opinion." Let me repeat that. We need to do more listening in the study of public opinion. She went on to say we should pay attention to the social categories that people find meaningful as opposed to the categories we presuppose are important. In today's environment, we often fall victim to chasing the small and forgetting the large. We write more about less. We lurch from one shiny object to the next. Separating wheat from chaff is always a tall order, particularly in the heat of the competitive moment. We often have trouble providing the necessary context and perspective. That's the curse, or perhaps simply the reality, of journalism in an era where the competitive pressure to post stories instantly on the web is so strong. We can't eliminate this kind of reporting and writing. We don't want to. Our readers now demand it. But we don't want it to come at the expense of keeping our eyes fixed on big issues. We need to maintain our ambitions to ask and answer large questions. And that too set Dave apart from others. He had an unerring ability to stay focused on what was most important. I remember a moment in early 2000. I had gotten fixated on some small bore problem that seemed to be causing trouble for Al Gore in his contest against Bill Bradley. Dave's piece that week, which was based on higher altitude reporting and sounder analysis, declared that Gore was finally taking control of the race. My take on events that week was extremely transitory. Dave had the real story. We always need to pay attention to the underlying forces as much as to the inside game. Think about this. What was more important to the outcome of the 2012 election? Barack Obama's ads attacking Mitt Romney's record at Bain Capital and as governor of Massachusetts, or the fact that the white share of the electorate dropped from 74 to 72% between 2008 and 2012? Dave was not a prude about negative advertising or the kinds of attacks that take place in all campaigns. He loved a tough and gripping election. He appreciated that campaigns are a contact sport and often highly entertaining just for the sake of entertainment. He could gossip with the best of them at the end of the day on the trail. But fundamentally, he saw campaigns as a means to an end, not simply a game of winners and losers. He believed that good journalism made the machinery of government work better, that journalism is an integral part of the democratic society. How often do we stop and ask whether the conduct of campaigns today makes governing easier or more difficult or even possible? Dave believed that when the campaign was over, politicians had a responsibility to do what they could to solve the country's problems. He hated frivolousness in public officials, and he believed in holding them accountable. I have no doubt that a lot of what we've seen in Washington and around the country these past few years would have troubled Dave immensely. He probably would have hated some of what has come to be routine in campaigns, and I know he would have seen the breakdown in governing as something deeply disturbing. There is something, however, that I think would have given Dave cause for optimism, and it is something that I believe should give all of us cause for optimism, and that is the rising generation of political reporters. In the past half dozen years, there's been a major generational shift in the nation's political press corps. Those of my generation are being succeeded by a new crop of reporters and editors, digital producers, photographers, videographers, graphic artists, and the like, who bring new skills to an old game. As our editor, Marty Barron, likes to say, we used to hire young people for what we could teach them. Now we hire them for what they can teach us. The talent level among those in this generation is incredibly high. I see it every day at the Washington Post, and I see it at other news organizations as well. And I feel it most when I am out on the trail myself these days trying to keep up with them. I will not try to name names tonight. There are simply too many, and I would mistakenly leave someone out. But we are in very good hands, especially if we embrace and adapt what Dave Broder taught us to the demands and realities of the current era. That will be one way to begin to regain the public trust and to invigorate the political system, and that would make David S. Broder very happy. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for honoring my late friend and colleague, and thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions. So this being New Hampshire, fire away.
Dan, at what age did you know you wanted to do this?
It's a great question. I got hooked on journalism and politics in college. I'd done a little writing for my high school paper and worked on the yearbook, and I went off to the University of Illinois with no fixed idea of what I wanted to do. And at the end of my freshman year, my brother, who was 3 years older and was in the journalism program, said to me, you should go to work for the student newspaper, which was a 5-day-a-week, independent, totally student-run news organization. And so that fall of my semester, that fall of my sophomore year, I did. I went to work for the Daily Illini. I worked mostly on the paper that semester. I went on academic probation as a result of it. A little hard to explain to my parents, but they eventually understood. And that summer, after that summer, I got an internship in Washington working for the congressman from my home district, one John B. Anderson, who many of you later saw up here in 1980 when he ran for president. And it was that combination of the work I'd done at the student paper and the summer in Washington that really got me hooked. The other thing that did it, frankly, was reading Teddy White's The Making of the President in 1960, which is still the best book on the making of a president ever. And a book that if you haven't read and like politics, you should read, and if you've read it, read it again. I read it regularly. So that's how I got it.
How has Citizens United changed the nature of your work?
Well, I alluded to this in my remarks. Citizen United and the other related court cases, which have given us super PACs and the organizations that we now describe as the dark money groups, which are not one and the same, has done a couple of things. One, it has allowed candidates who probably could not sustain themselves in a presidential primary to live to fight another day, for better or worse. There's no question that Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum were kept alive during very difficult times by the fact that they had a super PAC that was able to run some ads and help them regroup and get back in the game. If you look at what happened in the general election in 2012, you might say that the super PACs had no particular impact. You know, when each campaign, the Romney campaign and the Obama campaign, is spending $1 billion itself, and the super PACs come in with additional money, it's not clear that they were decisive in the outcome. Having said that, I think that there is something corrupting about this on the process. As I say, I think that that the rush for money across the board in donations that are regulated and donations that are not regulated, in going after contributions of $1 million or $5 million or $10 million or $30 million by a single donor. We can see this already happening in the 2016 cycle, this rush for money. It creates a sense of a barrier between the people playing the game and the people who are supposed to decide the outcome. And I don't think that there is any easy or quick solution to this, given the direction that the Supreme Court is going. I think that we could end up in the not too distant future with even fewer limits on things. And so, you know, as I said about Dave and negative ads, I'm not a prude about this. I don't think there's a magic formula, but I do believe that we lack transparency, and we lack something that says to average folks, you've got a stake in this game, and we need to hear from you. And if politicians forget that, there's every good reason for people to be cynical about their elected representatives. So I think the other thing that we are likely to see in this cycle is that super PACs dedicated to an individual candidate could well play an even more significant role in that candidate's operation. As you know, there's supposed to be a firewall between a candidate's campaign and the super PAC supporting that candidate. But I've heard conversations among people who have been involved in campaigns who think that a smart candidate will load up a super PAC and focus on raising money as much for that super PAC as they do for their own campaign, and entrust that super PAC with even more of the responsibility for advertising or get out the vote or any number of things that have usually been the purview of a campaign. And so I think this cycle is only likely to deepen the role of the super PACs with the consequences that I described.
Aiden. I've always wanted the chance one time in my life to ask you a question. Instead of the other
For those who don't know Dayton Duncan, former Mondale spokesperson in the '84 campaign who lived through that night.
I remember those nights too, those last 4 nights there. I was very heartened by what you said about the upcoming crop of reporters, the new generation. But I have this one fear as someone who's been in politics and in journalism in my lifetime, which is that over time, as budgets for news operations shrink, at the same time that other portals are opening for information, it seems to me that the proportion of people like yourself and like David, who actually went out and did real reporting, to the number of people who gab about it, whether, you know, even somebody like me, a failed political operative, could, you know, probably make a living, you know, talking somewhere about whether you're right or not. And as you know, I would not be right if it was me. But that proportionality just keeps going to me in the wrong direction. My nightmare is that at some point, at the way things are going, there will be one reporter left in the United States. There's only one person to give us the facts upon which everybody else is left to pontificate. I just wonder if you feel that trend, or if you've got something to say to help me sleep at night.
Well, I hope you sleep well at night, no matter what my answer. I think you describe a problem that exists. There are a lot of people who yak about politics based on the reporting of others. You know, as somebody mentored by David Broder, I believe you can't cover American politics from the comfort of your newsroom. That you have to get out and understand the country. That if you are not doing that, you are skimming along the surface of a set of conventional wisdom notions of where things are. When you get out in any state, you understand how deep and rich the political culture of each state is, and that they're all different. Each state has its own political history. And to understand why things happen, it's better to understand that from the ground up rather than from sitting in the office. What I like is that there are a lot of organizations now, and I hope this continues to be the case, that feel some dedication to political coverage, and that within those organizations there are some people who feel it necessary to get out and around the country and engage with voters and watch candidates interact with voters. I mean, as a reporter coming to this state, you cannot watch a candidate spend 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months in town hall meetings and not watch them change. And one example I can cite is Pat Buchanan, who came up here during the recession of '91 and spent a lot of time in this state and was clearly affected by the stories he heard at town hall meeting to town hall meeting. And as a reporter, you feel that too. I remember being in South Carolina during the epic battle between George W. Bush and John McCain, and being at a rally or a meeting that Bush was having, and he got a question about immigration. And you know, I'd spent some years in Texas, so the immigration issue was not new to me. I'd covered that subject in a lot of different places, but it wasn't something I associated with South Carolina. You know, you think of it as border states or some of the western states. And what I realized was the changing America. I mean, Adlai Stevenson had this wonderful expression, there's a new America every morning when we wake up, whether we like it or not. And that was a sort of a moment for me to say, this issue goes well beyond the boundaries that we think it does. And so it's those kinds of things that as a reporter help inform your coverage. And I believe that there are enough in the new generation who will carry it on. Yes, ma'am.
Despite having town halls, a lot of answers we get from politicians and candidates are sound bites with no depth, no substance. What can we do to promote more of that and promote the journalists to do more of that kind of digging?
I've always thought you all do a pretty good job of that, frankly. I've never found New Hampshire audiences to be willing to take sound bites for an answer. You know, it's a good question. You know, it can be intimidating to stand up at a public event and ask a question of a politician and then feel the need to ask a follow-up to suggest politely or impolitely that, madam or sir, you didn't quite answer my question, I'd like more. But I think that to the degree that you're able to do that, politicians get the message. And they will begin to respond to it. I mean, every politician has a default set of answers to questions. And, you know, we're in an era when they have more handlers than they need. And those handlers and strategists are very protective of the candidates and try to guide them away from saying or doing anything that would cause them to make news, for example. God forbid that they ever went and made news. But they're human too, and the interaction that they have will affect them. And so just keep being persistent. And if you're getting boilerplate, try to get them to go at least a step beyond or 2 steps beyond. Yes, sir.
How has the New Hampshire primary changed, both as a journalist covering it and more generally?
Well, I mean, it's now one of the great spectacles of American politics. I mean, and this is not new. I mean, this is a phenomenon that we've noticed for a number of years. You know, I can't remember which campaign this was, 96 or 2000. I ran into somebody at a rally one Saturday morning down in Manchester and got to talking and, you know, quickly realized that this was not a New Hampshire voter. This was somebody who had come in from out of state. And he said, I come in every year. You know, I take a week of vacation because this is the only place I can see a candidate. And he, you know, he had his checklist. I mean, he was seeing more candidates that day than I was. You know, the dirty little secret about New Hampshire, which is one reason we all like it compared to Iowa, is that you can get to a lot of events in this state relatively easily. The joke about Iowa is that wherever you are, the next event that you want to cover is a 2-hour drive away. Unless you're going to the North Country, that's never the case. And as Jack Germond once told me, the Germond rule is never go to the North Country with a politician, with a presidential candidate who's below 20% in the polls, which I've taken to heart. But I think that part of it is it's gotten bigger and more rambunctious, and I think that the intimacy of New Hampshire, particularly in that week between Iowa and New Hampshire, is basically gone. It's now huge events. The candidates are cloistered. Back in the old days, we were talking at dinner about, in the old days when I was a very young reporter. You'd be at the Wayfair and, there would be a candidate just kind of hanging out there. I mean, Gene McCarthy in his later years, seemed to be up here for every primary, and he'd just hang out in the Wayfair. But you would see people in a more informal way. I mean, the first time I ever really had a conversation with Secretary Clinton was during the '92 campaign, and people had been out campaigning for the day, and she and a couple of people she was traveling with had come back to the Wayfair, and there were 3 or 4 reporters, and we just sat down and had dinner together. Now, you just can't imagine that happening today. There's a separation, and I think all of you probably feel that as well. The other thing that the other change is that, even though this is still a state where face-to-face campaigning is important, television is more and more and more important. If you don't have the money for television in this state, it's tough to get your message out in the way that you were able to get it out before. So in those ways, it's changed. But the thing about New Hampshire is that candidates come early, they come regularly, and as a reporter, if you're here, in those early stages, you still get access and you still get a sense of what's really going on in the state.
What's your favorite New Hampshire primary war story? Something that you had access to, you just can't believe you saw it, you can't believe they said that, or that was on the record, I can't believe it.
All right, now, other than Epping, there is a moment that I believe happened. I say I believe it happened because we're in a period when sometimes we misremember things. And so I will tell this story as if I lived it because I think I did, but if you can't find any evidence of it, then I just made it up. But at any rate, this was the week before the primary in 1992. And, Clinton was scrambling for his political life, and he had gone down to, where was it, E.J., Nashua, to a senior citizens home. And Senior Center. What's that? Yeah. Correct. And an elderly woman had talked about how she could either buy food or her medication, but she couldn't afford both. And Clinton, at the end of it, walked down and embraced her in the way only Bill Clinton was able to do. So fast forward a couple of days, we are out on Saturday morning, and he and Hillary Clinton were out in Manchester, kind of going up and down the street, talking to voters. And there was a little girl there, and they leaned down and talked to her, and as my memory reminds me or says, he said to her, "What's your name?" And she said, "Destiny." And he said, "Destiny, we've been looking for you for a long time." So as they say, too good to check. Yes.
With Stephen Colbert and now Jon Stewart, both announcing that they're moving on to other things, do you see them as sort of just sui generis, incredibly talented people who sort of fit the zeitgeist, or are they reflective of something new in American journalism? And just be curious as to your reaction.
Yeah, I think they're both amazingly gifted. They both have in their own particular way, an ability to marry, in a sense, journalism with entertainment that reaches an audience that my journalism, or, well, E.J. probably reaches some that I don't reach, but that our journalism doesn't reach. And I give both of them credit for saying it's time to do something different. Colbert obviously had always wanted to succeed Letterman, and more power to him. And we will see a different Stephen Colbert on Late Night with Stephen Colbert than we did on the Colbert Report, because he's now out of character and into his own skin, or presumably will be. And Jon Stewart, after 16 years, said, it's time to do something different. I mean, would that we all knew when it was time to move on. But I don't know that that they're easily replaceable, but there will be something that will come along that will be the next generation of it. I mean, there always is. Somebody who is incredibly bright and inventive and creative will come up with some other way to reach an audience that conventional journalism isn't reaching.
I'm going to ask you something that I puzzle over, and I'm curious how you puzzle over it, which is, and it goes a little bit to Dayton's question. So we're in this very paradoxical time where, on the one hand, there is more information available than ever. In the phone in my pocket, I can read lots of newspapers, from the Washington Post, New York Times, to the Concord Monitor, to God knows where else. I can find data. You've got all of that. You've got new creations like our Wonk blog or Vox or the Upshot, which are really giving people, I think, a lot of information that, complicated information in a digestible way that we didn't used to do. So you've got an enormous improvement in a certain sense, and yet we don't have the same common, the multiplicity of sources means we don't have the same common conversation we had. And the fact that newspapers aren't subsidized by advertising anymore is probably going to make them more of an elite product. And the beautiful thing about journalism is that it's small d democratic. And once upon a time, not that long ago, you could pay a quarter for the Washington Post. Now, some would say you got what you paid for, but I don't think so. And so to me, there are these things, and we're under financing, particularly, I think, to go to Dayton's point, state and local coverage compared to what we used to do. How do you sort of, when you think about this strange moment we're in, how do you balance the equities? And by the way, I salute you for what you said about the young reporters. I totally agree with that.
Thank you. I think about it all the time, because so much of what you describe is all to the good. It makes all of you smarter to the extent you're able to take advantage of it. I think what it does for what we are used to doing, it puts a greater premium on one of the things I said in the piece, which is to keep our eye on the big things. Because, there are bites of information everywhere that, it's like a conveyor belt that goes faster and faster and faster. And if you don't grab it fast enough, it's suddenly gone. And I think that what we've got to do at a place like the Washington Post is find a way to provide, in a sense, the full buffet, and to create, if you will, a brand for political coverage or other types of coverage that will draw an audience that feels it wants to stay informed as best they can. But, we all go to many sources of information. We go to find individual writers and reporters. I mean, my pal Ron Brownstein, take anything he does on polling to the bank because he's brilliant at understanding and breaking down the numbers of politics. There are a variety of people like that, and as you say, Upshot and Vox and Wonk blog and various places that are now using data-driven journalism to talk about and write about politics. All of that is great. What I worry about is that the conversation is limited too much to fluff. That there is too much concentration on that. I don't know how you change that. I mean, people decide what they want to read or watch or listen to, and I think that the only thing we can do And Marty Barron has talked about this, not just in the political coverage, but coverage in general. A lot of what we do, there's going to be some people who don't like it. And his view is, so be it. You have to set your own compass journalistically. You have to follow the instincts that you think are right. And you have to find a way to build an audience for that, no small task. But I think if you do that, in the end, quality will win out. And there will be enough of an audience for good journalism in a variety of different ways that, that it will continue to, succeed and prosper. Yes, sir.
What do you think Hillary Clinton learned from her 2008 campaign, and how will it influence her next campaign?
Well, it's a great question, and we speculate on that round the clock these days. I assume she learned that you have to have a campaign team that is functional and not dysfunctional, that you have to have a campaign team that knows what a caucus is, and that how important delegates at caucuses can be. I think in the end what she's probably learned is that she's got to figure out a way to connect herself to voters in spite of the fact that she's surrounded by Secret Service and a passel of reporters everywhere she goes. I think she is, at this point, working very hard to put together a campaign that will be better run and more tightly disciplined than the last campaign. But the unanswered question is, will she be a different candidate this time around? And I think you can look at the book tour and you can look at some of the other things and you can say, jury is still out on that. What will she be like? She's in a unique position. We've never seen in an open race a candidate who essentially has no opposition for the nomination. Now, we say that and we'll find a year from now that somebody here is going to, scurry around her and give her a scare. That would be good for everything. Good for journalism and probably good for Hillary Clinton. But I would guess that that's what she's learned. That she's got to find a different way to present herself, to be authentic, not to be somebody she isn't, not to be the product of focus groups and polls, but to kind of reach down inside her and know who she really is. You had a question.
I did. We worried about Citizens United and its effect on politicians and the effect of big money. Something you said also raised in my mind a question of the effect of the mass media and the buying up of multiple media sources. You said that many journalists present narratives that reinforce rather than challenge biases. Later on you said the younger generation you see as being independent sources, but what do you see as the effect of kind of the buying up of media sources to present a certain bias?
Well, it's it's a chicken-egg question. You can say Fox News did it. You could say MSNBC mimicked it and now does it. But I think all of that is a function of a broader change that's happened in our politics. And that is people are more intensely partisan than they once were. There's a lot of interesting political science data on this that shows the widening gap between left and right. But not just that. It is, and I alluded to this, the apocalyptic nature of how one side sees the other. I know going out in 2012 and talking to people on either side of that divide, if you talk to people at a Romney rally and said to them, what happens, what do you think, what's at stake in this election? What happens if Barack Obama gets a second term? And for many of the people in those audiences, not all, but for any number of people in those audiences, the reaction was the America that that has become the greatest country in the world, and the values that led to that will be irreparably eroded. That this country that we have watched for so many years will no longer exist in that form. And if you went to an Obama rally and said the same question, what happens if the Republicans add the White House to, at that point, the House and now the Senate? What's the consequence of that? And again, for any number of people in those audiences, the reaction was, every bit of progress that this country has made over the last half century will begin to be reversed. Now, obviously those are extreme views, and yet they were deeply felt, personally felt. As I was saying, you have to accept and honor what people think about things. You don't have to like it one side or the other. What we know is that if you're a Republican or a Democrat today, you feel about as positive toward your own party as you did 20 years ago. But you feel much more negative about the other party. And so that's the nature of politics today. The single most important thing, we talk about how campaigns gather all this data on all of us, and they know everything about us. They know the kind of car we drive, and they know what magazines we read, and they know whether we drink wine or beer or whiskey or Coke or Pepsi or whatever, and they put all that in and they figure out how to manipulate us. The truth is, the single most important thing that any campaign can know about a person is, are they a Democrat or are they a Republican? Because if they're a Democrat or a Republican, 9 times out of 10 they're going to vote for the nominee of that party for president, and now increasingly for governor or senator or House of Representatives. So I think that the news media or the media reflects that now. And as I said, it is now easy for people to find information that plays to their own view of the world. And as we know, the internet can be a great source of information, and it can be a great source of misinformation. And there's a lot of misinformation that floats around that becomes, accepted as fact. So people in the campaigns will talk about this, I think. Jeb Bush is talking about it. I'm sure Hillary Clinton will talk about it. But I don't know if there's any politician right now who can kind of break through that. It would take somebody extraordinary to do it, and I think what it takes is, collectively, voters to kind of reach a conclusion that this is hurting all of us, no matter what side of the divide we're on, and that we need a functioning government in Washington to begin to address and solve a lot of problems. So, thank you.
I want to confess I'm a Roman Catholic, and I say that to you because as a Roman Catholic,
talk to the mic.
As a Roman Catholic, I believe in an afterlife, and some days that's comforting, and some days it's kind of scary. But in the context of the Rudman Center, it means I might see Warren Rudman again. And I don't want him ever to say, "What were you doing with my name down there, John?" I don't worry about that tonight, and I don't worry about it with respect to David Broder either. That was an extraordinary talk. I want to thank Matt Broder. I want to thank E.J. Dionne and Dan Balz. And what I'd like to do is to ask Matt to come up, E.J. to come up, and Betsy Gardella to come up, if I can. Because I want to present the award, and I'd like all of us to kind of be in the photo, since all of you have much to do with this. The award that I'm presenting you, Dan, was crafted by Pepe Herman, who was a noted New Hampshire craftsman. And at the very top of the pyramid is a typewriter. And when I saw the David Broder Memorial Service, there was a typewriter proudly displayed. And so it says David Broder Award, in recognition of outstanding reporting on national politics, presented to Daniel J. Balz, The Washington Post, February 18, 2010. The Warren B. Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Policy, UNH School of Law. This is the first. It will not be the last. You have honored us to be here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I want to say one thing about this. This typewriter reminds me of, Dave was not the most technologically advanced person in our newsroom. And when we got laptop computers, I remember him going off to New Hampshire for the first time with a laptop, but he also carried his portable typewriter with him just in case.
One last thing before people step away. I was not aware that David Broder was a big Cubs fan, but at his memorial service, his Chicago Cubs jacket was there, and you saw it tonight. And so I thought it would be kind of fitting to also present a Chicago Cubs hat, which I think would make him proud. And so I want to give you that as well.
Thank you.
I also have here, you know, when you become a dean of a law school or now the executive director of a center, you take courses in marketing, whether you choose to or not. And so I know there are 4 Broder sons, and I have a Rudman Center hat for all of you. I have a Rudman Center hat for E.J. Dionne and for Dan Balz. I would also like to give to I would also like to give to E.J. Dionne a small token of our affection for being here tonight as well. It has been a memorable occasion, and you had a lot to do with that. So please accept this. And lastly, I'm almost out of gifts, I promise. I have a pair here of Warren B. Rudman Center cufflinks, which I'd like to give to, to Matt.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Before you go, and everyone can be seated, I promise it's late and the food is getting cold. I just wanted to say one thing about the center. Some of you have been here, some of you haven't. The center was started with the help and the blessing of Warren Rudman. And he was an amazing man, in part because he wanted to find solutions, and they didn't always have to be his solutions. But mostly I started the Rudman Center with his help because I believe that the younger generation, represented over here, students here, loved public service as much as I did, aspired to it as much as I did. But for many of them, it's not possible because they have debt and expenses I did not have. I grew up in a middle-class home. I went to Virginia Law School and Holy Cross College. I left with no debt. Not possible today unless you're really smart or really rich. And so the goal of the Rudman Center was and remains to inspire young people to public service through events like this, and to make it possible for a select few Warren B. Rudman Fellows to come here at no cost with the hope that they will do public service. That's really what this is all about. In order to make it possible, we need to fill rooms like this so that the Rudman Center has a public face and a public purpose of civic engagement. And if I do it well, and if we do it well, another part of my day job is to raise money. And about 2 years ago, they excised my blush gland. I ask for money now without any blushing. Relax, I'm not asking tonight. But what I am asking you to do is to consider these events are always free and always open to the public, and that will remain true. But you and I know the world is not free. And so there are brochures, I think you may have received them. Become a member of the Rudman Center. It's not a huge investment, but it's a huge investment for these law students and for what we're trying to do here. And so if you'd consider becoming a member of the Rudman Center, I would be grateful. If you choose not to, you're always welcome here. You won't get very good seats, but you'll always be welcome here. I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding. But to have events like this tonight in Concord, New Hampshire on a snowy February is extraordinary. I read these gentlemen. I don't often meet them. And I don't often have an opportunity to have them in our house. So if you would help us build this center, it's for you and for them. And I know Warren Rudman would be pretty proud. So thank you for coming. I understand we have food that's probably now cold downstairs. If you can stay for another 15 or 20 minutes, I think our guests will do that. Lastly, I would want to thank New Hampshire Public Radio and Betsy Cardella. Couldn't have a better partner. And tomorrow, or tomorrow night, these two gentlemen will be on The Exchange with Laura Kanoy. Please tune it in. I know I will. Thank you again for coming.